Welcome to a deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're plunging into, well, a concept that seems to be absolutely everywhere, but can be pretty slippery to pin down. Globalization.
It really is. It's a term you hear constantly, isn't it? News, politics, even just, talking about daily life.
Exactly. So, using the sources you've shared, our mission today is to try and cut through some of that noise.
Right. To really unpack what globalization is, look at what drives it, the causes, and then dig into its consequences, which are, well, they're incredibly varied, often contradictory even.
That's a great way to put it, contradictory. This deep dive is really designed to give you that essential understanding, sort of a shortcut to seeing the shape of this huge global force.
Okay, so at its heart, the sources tell us globalization is about worldwide interconnectedness.
Yeah, this constant sort of increasing flows of ideas, capital, commodities.
And people moving across borders.
And a really crucial point right from the start, its impact is profoundly uneven. It doesn't look the same everywhere or, for everyone within a society.
Definitely not. So let's unpack this core idea. First, globalization as these flows.
Okay.
The sources bring this alive pretty quickly with some very specific human examples. Makes it much clearer.
They really do. You think of Janarhan working nights in an Indian call center.
Right, serving clients overseas, basically acting as a local service provider for someone in a totally different time zone, different culture.
That's the globalization of services right there in that one story.
Exactly. And then there's Ramdari buying a bicycle for his daughter.
Manufactured where?
China, continents away. That simple purchase, it just shows this massive flow of commodities, doesn't it? All enabled by global trade.
And Sarika's story, too. That one struck me.
Yeah. How so?
Well, she's a first-generation learner, gets a job, an opportunity that just wasn't there for women in her family before.
So new possibilities opening up.
Yes, pushing boundaries, maybe bringing wider acceptance for certain changes. But the sources also mentioned it creating tension, right? A conflict of values with older traditions, perhaps.
Absolutely. And what's powerful about using these kinds of examples is how they instantly show globalization isn't just one thing.
And not always positive.
It's definitely not always positive. The sources are explicit. The term gets used in wildly different ways, sometimes linked to real hardship.
Like the farmer suicides example. Heartbreaking. Linked to expensive seeds from multinational companies, MNCs.
Yes. Or think about local shopkeepers worried that big international retail chains will just push them out.
That touches on those economic power shifts, yeah.
And it's not just economics either. There's that cultural anxiety, too.
Oh, yeah, the Mumbai film producer accused of lifting a Hollywood plot.
Or militant groups threatening girls for wearing clothes seen as Western.
These aren't just random anecdotes, are they? They really underline a key point from the sources.
Which is?
That globalization can have really significant negative consequences. And it's definitely not just about economics.
Or just about rich countries imposing things on poorer ones. It's way more complex than that. A whole web of influence and impact.
Okay, so if these kinds of flows, trade, migration, ideas moving around, if that's been happening for centuries, what makes now so different? What's speeding up this contemporary wave?
That's a key question. And the sources are pretty clear.
Yeah.
Yes, the historical basis is there. Flows have always happened. But the defining thing about contemporary globalization is the sheer scale and the speed of these flows.
Scale and speed. Okay. And what enables that?
Well, the critical element is technology, no question.
Technology, right. The telegraph, the telephone.
A microchip. These weren't just clever inventions. They fundamentally revolutionized communication. How quickly, how easily we connect globally.
So ideas can spread almost instantly.
Pretty much. Capital can be moved with a click. Logistics for moving commodities, goods over vast distances become incredibly efficient.
But there's an unevenness there you mentioned.
Yes, the sources point this out quite clearly. While capital and goods move incredibly fast, people often can't.
Why is that?
Mostly visa policies. Developed countries restricting movement, often to protect jobs at home. So not all flows are equally free.
That's a really important distinction to make. But the sources also said it's not just the technology driving this, right? Something about recognition.
Yes, exactly. Globalization is also fueled by, let's call it an increased awareness, a recognition of our interconnections.
How so?
Well, events in one part of the world are felt almost immediately elsewhere now. Think about bird flu, for instance, or a tsunami. They don't respect national borders, do they?
Oh, of course not.
And major economic events, too. A financial crisis somewhere that sends ripples globally very quickly. We're just much more aware, I think, that we live in this connected system.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at the consequences, starting with the political dimension.
Right. And a major debate the sources highlight here is how globalization affects state sovereignty, the power of the nation state.
Does it make the state weaker or stronger or just different?
Well, the sources basically lay out three ways to think about this impact. The first argument is that globalization leads to an erosion of state capacity.
Erosion, meaning the state actually becomes weaker, less able to do things.
Precisely. The thinking is that the old welfare state, the state heavily involved in providing social security, health care, economic direction, that model gives way.
To what?
To a more minimalist state, one that focuses mainly on core functions like law and order, national security.
Yeah.
It pulls back from those broader welfare roles.
And the market steps in?
The market becomes the prime determinant of economic and social priorities, in this view.
And what about those big multinational companies, the MNCs?
They play a big role here, too. Their global reach, their economic clout. It can reduce a government's ability to make decisions independently, especially if those decisions might hurt corporate interests.
Okay, so that's one view, state erosion. But the sources offer a counterpoint too, don't they?
They do. The second perspective is that state capacity isn't always reduced, that the state in many ways remains incredibly powerful.
How does that work?
Well, the primacy of the state is still very real. Old rivalries between countries, they haven't vanished.
Sure.
States still perform essential functions, law and order, national security are still paramount. And crucially, states often choose to withdraw from certain areas. Rather than just being forced out, they're making strategic decisions. The state is far from irrelevant.
Okay, so not necessarily weaker, just maybe shifting focus. And then there's a third possibility, the sources mention, which I found really interesting.
Which is?
That globalization might actually boost state capacity in some ways.
Yeah, that's maybe the most surprising angle. The very same technologies that help global flows.
Like communication tech, data processing.
Exactly. They also give states enhanced tools to collect information about their citizens, for example.
So better monitoring, better control.
Potentially, yes. It could make them more efficient at governing, but also increase their capacity for surveillance, potentially consolidating certain kinds of state power.
So it's really not a simple story of the state just shrinking away?
Not at all. It's more like a complex transformation, reshaping how and where state power is exercised, rather than just diminishing it overall.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move to the economic consequences. This is often, well, it feels like the main event in many discussions about globalization, doesn't it?
It really is. It's often the central focus, and the sources definitely highlight that debate.
And they define it quite broadly, right? It's not just about the big institutions like the IMF or the WTO.
No, though they're definitely part of the picture. It's fundamentally about how the economic gains and the losses from all these increased global flows get distributed. Who benefits, who loses out.
And the flows themselves are huge. We're talking greater trade in commodities.
Yeah, partly because import restrictions have come down in many places.
And much fewer restrictions on capital movement, money flowing around the globe.
Right. Investors in richer countries can put their money almost anywhere else, looking for better returns. And then there's the flow of ideas, economic ideas, data, services, all supercharged by the internet and computing.
But again, that crucial caveat about people movement.
Yes, worth repeating. While capital and goods zip around, people's ability to move for work is still heavily restricted, especially by developed countries using visa policies. Protecting domestic jobs is usually the stated reason.
And the sources really hammer home this point. Don't make simple generalizations.
Absolutely. Similar policies applied in different countries or contexts can have wildly different results. You just can't assume a uniform outcome.
Which naturally leads to intense disagreement about economic globalization.
Fierce disagreement. On one side, you have those really focused on social justice concerns.
Their worry is that as the state pulls back from welfare functions, it mainly benefits a small elite.
Right. And it leads to impoverishment for those who depended on government support, on public sector jobs, on those safety nets.
So they argue for what? Stronger safeguards?
Institutional safeguards, social safety nets, yes. Though some critics feel even those are insufficient, or maybe just unworkable in the current global system.
And the more vocal critics.
They might even call for halting what they see as forced economic globalization altogether. They view it as potentially ruinous for weaker economies, for the poor. Some even use the term recolonization.
Strong words. But then you have the other side, the advocates.
Yes, those who argue quite forcefully that deregulation, opening up trade, actually leads to greater economic growth and overall improves well-being for more people.
Their argument is that trade lets economies specialize in what they do best.
Right.
And that benefits the whole world.
That's the core idea. And some see this increasing integration as just inevitable, a historical process you can't, or maybe shouldn't try to, stop.
And between those poles,
You have what the sources term moderate supporters,
Yeah.
people who see it not as inherently good or bad, but as a major challenge, something that needs to be navigated intelligently, critically, not just accepted blindly or rejected outright.
So lots of debate, very different experiences, but the sources identify one trend that seems undeniable. Just this ongoing, increasing interdependence, integration between governments, businesses, ordinary people right across the globe.
That trend seems pretty clear, yes, regardless of how you feel about it.
And moving beyond the boardrooms and the political debates, globalization clearly hits home. It affects our daily lives in really personal ways.
Absolutely. What we eat, drink, what we wear.
Even how we think, our preferences.
For sure. This brings us to the cultural dimension. And this often sparks fears about cultural homogenization.
Homogenization, the idea that everything starts to look the same.
Yeah.
That distinct cultures are fading.
Exactly. And often this fear is framed as the imposition of Western culture, particularly American culture. The soft power argument.
Like what? Burgers and blue jeans everywhere.
That's the classic example. Burgers, jeans, maybe the spread of certain business models, the sources mentioned, McDonaldization, this idea of efficiency-driven, standardized culture spreading.
And the worry is that this is dangerous, that it shrinks the world's cultural diversity.
That's the concern, yeah. Losing that rich global heritage.
But again, the sources present a counter-argument here, too.
They do. Cultural heterogenization.
The opposite effect. Cultures becoming more different.
Or at least becoming different in new ways. The idea is that cultures aren't static things that just get overwhelmed. They're dynamic. They absorb outside influences, they adapt, they mix things up.
So, influences don't just replace local culture.
Not necessarily. They might just enlarge choices. Adding a burger to the menu doesn't automatically mean you stop eating your local food.
Good point. Or the influences blend.
Exactly. They blend in interesting ways without totally overwhelming what was there before. The sources give that great example.
The kari krita with jeans.
Yeah. A uniquely Indian combination, mixing traditional and modern, local and global. And apparently that look even gets exported back to places like the U.S. sometimes.
That really highlights the point, doesn't it? That cultural exchange, even with power differences, it's rarely just a one-way street.
It's much more of a dynamic mix-and-match adaptation process.
Okay, let's bring this deep dive even closer to home now. Let's look at India's experience with globalization, as the sources describe it.
Right. And India actually has a very long history of being part of these global flows, going way back.
But the colonial period really shaped that experience, didn't it?
Profoundly. It essentially turned India into an exporter of raw materials, primarily to Britain, and a consumer of finished goods from Britain. A very specific, unequal relationship.
So, based on that history, after independence, India took a different path.
Yes, it chose protectionism, trying to build up its own domestic industries by limiting imports, limiting foreign investment.
The goal was self-reliance.
That was the idea. But the sources note a downside. Relatively slow economic growth compared to some other countries, and, critically, they argue, neglect of key public sectors, health, housing, primary education, didn't get the investment they needed.
But then things changed dramatically. In 1991,
Yes, facing a financial crisis, but also wanting higher growth rates, India embarked on major economic reforms.
deregulating trade, opening up to foreign investment.
Pretty much. A significant shift towards integrating more deeply with the global economy, opening India up to these global flows in a much bigger way.
And the sources say the real test of these reforms isn't just the GDP numbers.
No. The ultimate test is whether the benefits of that growth are shared widely. Does it reach across the population?
And we get a little glimpse of the friction this creates, too, from that call center example again.
Right. The worker gaining insights into American culture, maybe earning a better wage.
But also facing abuse sometimes, callers resenting them, seeing them as taking jobs. That comment, gosh, an Indian again. Just shocking.
It really shows the tension, the resistance that can be embedded right within these global connections. It's not smooth.
Which brings us neatly to resistance itself. Globalization is, well, It's a contentious subject everywhere. Lots of criticism, lots of pushback.
Definitely. And the critics come from very different perspectives, as the sources show.
From the left, for instance.
The main concern there is usually about inequality. That global capitalism, turbocharged by globalization, makes the rich richer and the poor poorer.
And the state is too weak to help.
Right. The weakened state can't protect the vulnerable, can't ensure fairness. That's the argument.
But then there's criticism from the right as well.
Yes. Also, sometimes fearing a weakening of the state, but often coupled with a desire to go back to more self-reliance, more protectionism economically.
And cultural concerns are big there, too.
Very much so. Worries about losing traditional values, about the impact of foreign TV, things like Valentine's Day becoming popular, or Western clothing styles replacing traditional dress.
What's really fascinating, though, is how the resistance itself is often global.
That's a key point. Many so-called anti-globalization movements actually operate using global networks. They form alliances across countries.
And the sources suggest many aren't against being connected globally per se.
Exactly. Often they're opposing a specific program or version of globalization, one they see as neoliberal, or maybe imperialist, basically, a version they feel serves the interests of powerful corporations and states at the expense of others.
Are there examples of this kind of organized resistance?
Oh, yes. The sources mention the huge protests at the WTO meeting in Seattle back in 1999.
What was the issue there?
Allegations of unfair trade practices rigged by powerful countries, and a feeling that the interests of the developing world were just being ignored.
And then there's the World Social Forum, the WSF.
Right. A really interesting phenomenon. It's this global platform bringing together activists from all sorts of movements, human rights, environment, labor, youth, women's groups.
All united in opposing what they call neoliberal globalization.
Exactly. It's met in various places, Brazil, for instance, and the sources specifically mentioned it meeting in Mumbai back in 2004. A truly global counter-movement.
And within India specifically, we see resistance from both sides.
Yes, as we touched on. From the less political parties, groups like the Indian Social Forum, trade unions, farmers protesting against MNCs, fighting things like the patenting of traditional knowledge like the neem tree.
Went from the
Strong objections to cultural influences, foreign TV channels celebrating Valentine's Day, Western clothes, all seen as threats to Indian culture or values.
So these varied forms of resistance really underline that globalization isn't something people just passively accept?
Not at all. It's constantly being debated, contested, shaped by all these different social and political forces reacting to its different impacts.
Okay, so we've taken quite a journey here, a deep dive into globalization. Exploring it as this complex web of interconnected flows.
Looking at the forces speeding it up, mainly technology, but also that growing awareness.
Examining those really uneven, often contradictory consequences, political, economic, cultural.
And finally, looking at the different ways people push back the resistance it generates, both globally and specifically within India.
It's a concept that, as we said at the start, touches almost every corner of the world, every layer of society.
Hopefully laying out these examples, these different viewpoints from the sources, helps to bring some clarity to this huge and complex force.
I think it does. And for you listening, maybe take a moment now. Think about those examples we discussed, Janardhan, Ramdari, Sarika.
Yeah, and then look around your own life. What products do you use? Where do they come from? What about cultural influences you see around you? Music, food, ideas. Where might they have originated globally?
Where do you feel those connections? And maybe where do you see some of the friction, the tension that globalization can create?
It really makes you think. And it leaves us with a pretty fascinating question, building on everything we've discussed.
It is.
Well, if globalization is fundamentally about increasing interconnectedness, about these flows, ideas, capital, goods, people, does the resistance we talked about, does it aim to simply stop those flows altogether, to build walls? Or is the real goal maybe more about trying to redirect those flows, to steer them towards different outcomes, different destinations, perhaps outcomes that people feel are fairer, more equitable, or maybe less threatening to their local identities?
What does that mean for the future, for the direction of our increasingly connected world?
It's certainly a lot to keep thinking about long after this deep dive is over.